Hello, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, wherever in the world you are. I'm Bronwyn. I'm going to be your host for this evening, or today. It's evening for me. I'm based in Johannesburg, but of course, it's very different times of day for most of the rest of you dialing in from the more West Coast or East Coast side of the world to join us in CAS tonight, this evening. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes to see who else joins, just to make sure. So I think we'll give it to like 2 minutes past before we kick off. But we won't keep you waiting too long because you did all show up on time. And for that, I'm very grateful. But in the meantime, just to sort of reiterate the kind of housekeeping rules and norms of the Intellect, this is a super salon. So unlike many of the other salons you may have attended, it is being recorded. So if that is something that scares you or frightens you, moderate your comments in the chat and or turn off your video if that is so, if you so wish. Otherwise, we'd be very grateful to have you fully present and part of the conversation, as digitally unflattened as is possible through these screen-based interactions. Other than that, this is supposed to be a conversation. It's certainly not meant to be a lecture or a keynote speech. I'm very happy to field comments and questions that come through from the chat if anyone's feeling too shy to step up and say them for themselves. But we really do want to hear from all of you, any comments or questions that you have around the broader topic of habituation, and more specifically Cass's work and his latest book or co-authored book. So please do jump into the conversation as much as you like. We're quite a small group. We can do the formalities of raising our hands using the Zoom functionality here. But if you just want to jump into, I'm perfectly okay with that too. And I think that talking has taken us to 2 minutes past. So let's kick off properly right now and say again, I'm Bronwyn Williams. I'm hosting on behalf of Anna and Intellect. And today we're talking to Cass Sunstein about his new book, Look and Look Again, all about habituation. And just to kick things off, I thought it'd be nice if Cass, in his own words, could tell us two things. First of all, the inspiration behind this latest piece of work in his very prolific catalog. And secondly, some of the sort of key insights that came out of putting the book and the project together. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bronwyn. Thanks everyone for being here. So probably aware the last 30 years, we've had an explosion of work in the field of behavioral science. So we know more about human beings and how our minds work than at any point in human history. And because of the day it is, let's just note that Daniel Kahneman, who is probably more responsible than anyone for the explosion of understanding, died just a few days ago. And while this is, for those of us who worked with him and loved him, a time of grief, it's also a time of celebration. The fact that he died at 90 is no tragedy, and the fact that he lived the life he did is the opposite of a tragedy. What is that, a romance? Let's call it a romance between him and those who loved him and those who get to read him. In any case, he was keenly interested in habituation, but the topic of habituation is something that has received very little attention. So if you go to an airport right now, I travel a lot, there are a number of behavioral science books. Most of them are really terrible. And none of them is about behavioral science. They're about something else. I'm sorry, it's also true that none of them is about behavioral science, but what I should have said is none of them is about habituation. That's the more fundamental point. They are habituation silent. Now, let's emphasize, shall we, that habituation is fundamental to not only our species, but all living creatures. I'm going to give some particular examples in a moment, but as I speak, my Labrador Retriever, one of my two Labrador Retrievers, one of them is on my right. You might hear him if he gets excited. If he gets excited, it's because there's a surprise signal in his brain. So he's right now sleeping quietly because everything is the same as it was, or if it's changing slowly, that is, I'm talking maybe a little more animatedly than I was 15 minutes ago. That's kind of continuous with what he knows, and he's habituated to that, and it's time to sleep. Your ancestors, who are my ancestors, so we're all related, were like us, but they didn't speak that much, and they didn't really have legs, and they weren't very cultured. They were very attentive to change in their environment, and they would swim faster. If things were the same or changing very slowly, they would just be like this. And these are unicellular organisms.
Oi?
You're
Só receber.
Hi, Alice. These are our ancestors who were habituated, meaning they wouldn't be affected by things that were stable or that were changing very slowly. So that's abstract. Why write about this? It's completely fundamental. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's assume you're on vacation. It's going to be a week vacation in some place that's really sunny and nice. Do you have a sense of when you're going to be happiest on that vacation? The answer is 43 hours in. The data says 43 hours in is the high point. You're in Cape Town, and it's amazing. I've been to Cape Town, maybe the most beautiful place in the world. 43 hours in, that's the best. And the reason is after that 43 hours, the beauty of the place, the brightness of the sun, the amazingness of the people, the wonderfulness of champagne, they all continue, but you're kind of used to it a little, and it becomes less incredible, still incredible, but less incredible than 43 hours in. If you ask people on vacation, what do they like best about it? There's one word that crushes all the other words in terms of how often it's repeated. Guess what the word is? First. The first time I saw the beach, the first time I saw the hotel, the first sip of champagne. After that, there's habituation. So consider that data point one, 43 hours in has magic associated with it. Here's data point two. People are taken into a laboratory in which they are told you're going to be part of an experiment in which you'll make money if you cooperate with a teammate. Then they're told offline, you'll actually make more money if you don't tell the truth. You lie to your teammate, you'll make more money. Will people lie? The answer is yes, people will lie for the money. It's not an egregious lie, it's an experiment after all. They're not going to go to jail. It's not corruption, but they're lying. As they lie or not, their brain is hooked up to a monitor, which is seeing what's happening inside the head. The first lies produce an extreme reaction from the amygdala, which is in the brain. The amygdala registers strong emotion. So when people lie, their first lie, they are registering a big surprise signal, and the amygdala is saying aloud, no, don't lie. People say, yeah, amygdala, you're telling me not to lie. I hear you, but there's money, I'm going to lie. Here's the intriguing part. As the day goes on, the amygdala starts to quiet. And the increasing quiet of the amygdala, which isn't aroused anymore, is associated with more and bigger lies, which is to say that people habituate to their own misconduct, their own attentiveness to their own immorality diminishes over time. It's a form of habituation. Take that as example number two. Here's the third example. Suppose not that you're lying, but someone's lying to you. They're telling you something that's false. And let's suppose you hear it 2 times, 3 times, 5 times. What will happen to you? The data is very powerful that if we hear something twice, and more if we hear it 3 or 4 times, we will tend to believe it's true. Where if we hear it a first time, we will think, what? That is to say, people use a kind of heuristic, which is more familiar, truthier. This information is often powerful because if you hear something a couple of times, you get habituated to it. There isn't a surprise signal anymore. It's easier to process in the mind. And once something's easier to process in the mind, there's an association in the head with truthfulness. So lying by oneself or immorality, we habituate to. Beauty and wonder, we habituate to. Lies and terribleness from other people, we habituate to, which means that habituation can be a source of relative indifference to things that are fantastic, hence for many, midlife crisis. And it can also be a source of inattentiveness or relative indifference to things that are bad, like a relationship or a job, or horrible, like an authoritarian government.
There you go. We get used to pretty much anything. I think it was Terry Pratchett that said that a body can get used to pretty much anything other than being dead, which kind of sort of summed up, I think, quite a lot of the things you spoke about there. I wanted to go back to one of the points you made around lying. So you said that we get used to lying ourselves. One of the other things you wrote about in the book is that we get used to other people lying to us. And there was one statistic, I actually wanted to just read it out because I thought it was, this is the one that stuck with me. Like what happened in the United States after living through what has become known as the post-truth era, the number of Americans who said it was fine to exaggerate facts to make a story more interesting grew from 44% in 2004 to a staggering 66% in 2018. Was that statistic referring to politicians or to journalists or to like anything in general? But whatever it is, it's incredible that like 2/3 of us, the vast sort of constitutional majority are completely okay with being lied to as long as it's entertaining.
Completely. And that if you live in a culture where a journalist lying is intolerable, then a surprise signal goes off of a disapproval of a lie. But if journalists or politicians are lying a lot, then the surprise signal is gone, and people don't think it's so terrible and might even think it's like an odor that they're used to and that they don't notice. I'll tell you a personal story. I worked in the White House under President Obama, and someone said, someone very important, not the president, but someone said, in the first, I think, 6 weeks, if you leak to the press, you're fired. And that, I remember that. And I think to this day, the idea of leaking to the press, if you're working for the government, as taboo. You don't do that. So being fired is a pretty unpleasant experience. But also there was a moral signal given, which is to leak an unauthorized communication of what's happening internally to the press is a betrayal of your colleagues and a misuse of your position. That really stuck in the head. Now, there are people in governments who leak all the time, and they don't have the surprise signal. It's kind of like what you said, where leaking is, and we can all have our own judgment about whether leaking is bad. I just can't get rid of the fact that my amygdala goes, the very word leaking fires up my amygdala. And that's because the moral taboo was really instantiated. And if you live in a culture where, let's say, corruption is regular, I've been to nations where corruption is regular. And what the thing that amazes me most about being there is not the regularity of corruption, it's the the kind of green light from people who live in the country with the omnipresence of culture, of corruption. It's a thing. It's like riding a bicycle, and it's the people have habituated to that.
Well, do you have any examples then of how to dishabituate the post-truth era, or to dishabituate ourselves from lying and distrust? Because certainly from my perspective, I think many other people have written about it too, this sort of fundamental breakdown in trust, in interpersonal, international trust is one of the big problems that we have right now, particularly with the advances in technology now. When anything that comes out, so in fact, even me speaking on the screen, you should all have a fairly significant degree of skepticism that I'm even a real person, because the technology exists, that nothing digital is true anymore. Both true things can be presented as lies and lies can be presented as truth. This lack of ability to have any truth to hold on to is is definitely one of the more perhaps dangerous elements in our society right now. So do you have any ways to dishabituate ourselves from that? Because you spoke also quite a lot in the book around dishabituating experiments and examples of how to dishabituate yourself and be used to, saying, being in airplanes where people used to smoke all the time and like getting exposed to clean air and remembering what clean air could be like. And, those sorts of things are quite practical. But when it comes to issues of trust, it's very hard to sort of pin down, and lies too, right? So how do we actually, or are there any techniques we can use to sort of break those cycles?
So are you ChatGPT, Bronwyn? I thought you were a
Well,
person.
you will never know. That's the problem.
Okay, I thought ChatGPT wasn't able to do that yet, but amazing. You seem so real. Hooray.
Real.
You've
Excellent.
really exceeded what we thought were your capacities to construct human beings. Okay, let's talk about dishabituation generally, shall we? So ask yourself, if you would, whether you want to listen to a long song. Let's suppose it's Amazing New Song by Taylor Swift. That's admittedly a redundancy. All new songs by Taylor Swift are amazing, but let's suppose it's a long one, like All Too Well. Do you want to listen to it all the way through, or do you want to have a break? Upwards of 90% of people want to listen to it all the way through with respect to music. They want to, hear the whole song. They don't want to break in the middle of the song. But people who experience a break in the middle of songs enjoy the experience more. Pause over that if you would. It's true for listening to music. It's also true for having massages. People don't want to break from a massage, but people who have a break from a massage actually enjoy the massage better. And the reason is that once you have a break from a song or a massage, the dishabituation kicks in. So when you come back to it, you have a bit of a surprise signal, which had quieted when you were listening to it. So the fourth minute of a long Taylor Swift song, I say, is fantastic, but my scientific side says it's not as fantastic as this first minute or the second minute. If you have a break, then the fourth minute is the first minute or the second minute again. And so too, you have the amazingness of the first 5 minutes of a massage twice if you have a break. Okay, that's just data on breaks producing a surprise signal when you go back to it. And now let's get a little theoretical and not scientific. Some people are dishabituation entrepreneurs, meaning they're people who whose job it is to dishabituate others to something to which they become habituated. Now you can take your pick from music or movies or business or politics. Shakespeare was a dishabituation entrepreneur. And that's one reason why he's Shakespeare, that there are things in Hamlet and King Lear that are profoundly dishabituating. Hamlet is kind of about Oedipal stuff and wanting to sleep with your mother. And to see that, my gosh, that's jarring and makes you see the world in a way that has colors in it rather than gray. William Blake said, better to murder an infant in his cradle than to nurse unenacted desires. That's William Blake. That's a really dishabituating line. Let's not take it seriously, but let's, see what's going on there. And that's dishabituating. Mandela, a South African maybe person, Mandela was a dishabituation entrepreneur in the sense that he was one of a very large number of people who got South Africa and the world to get really big time dishabituated to the existence of apartheid. Many of those who rebelled against apartheid were able to see apartheid not as, a state of existence, but as a profoundly artificial and, what's the right word? You take your pick, thing that had been imposed. And Martin Luther King in the United States was a dishabituation entrepreneur with respect to segregation. Given my accent, I know a little bit more about that than about apartheid. But what King did was to say to both Black people and white people. Look at this system where the white kids go here and the Black kids go there, and the buses, what? And that was dishabituating. With respect to gender, Catherine McKinnon in the United States was and is the most important person behind the concept of sexual harassment. There was a time when sexual harassment was something to which men certainly and women to a large degree were habituated. And McKinnon was and is a dishabituation entrepreneur, saying with respect to sexual harassment, take a break and look at this from the outside. What? And that what wasn't just of disbelief, it was also about moral horror. Okay, and now with respect to misinformation and things online, each of us can be a little bit of a dishabituation entrepreneur. And if we're exposed to something that's untrue and we don't know whether it's true or not, then we're just in a state of uncertainty, and there's not much that can be done about that. But to contribute in ways large and small to a culture in which, let's say, intentional falsehoods aren't part of how things are, but instead are a violation of something, like respect for people. That even if that's insisted on in a quiet voice at the dinner table on Thursday night, that's a little step, a small step for mankind, a giant step for man.
There's also then the sort of aspect of kind of reinforcing the kind of behavior that we want, the sort of broader behavioral economics thing. And I think your co-author had a little study that she put together that involved building a kind of clone of a social media platform that's got people to rate it based on trust and distrust rather than like and dislike. Can you explain a bit more about that? I thought that's really interesting. I've also followed like Ben Gross's work around metricizing social media, so taking away all the likes that you see and replacing them rather just with the conversation. So I know a lot of people are concerned about that sort of quantifying of what we quantify or what we measure. That's what we sort of manage ourselves towards, and optimizing for likes is very different for optimizing for trustworthiness kind of signals.
Right. So what Tali, my co-author, did was, just as you say, there was a trust button, click trust. And the consequences were phenomenal, that the circulation of falsehoods diminished dramatically, and people's belief in truth, what turned out to be true, jumped dramatically. So imagine as an experiment that Facebook rolls out or Twitter rolls out. Twitter, I'm talking about a dinosaur. I'm talking about the rotary phone. X rolls out a trust button. The prediction is, why not pilot that for a week? Are you listening, Mr. Musk? Pilot a trust button for a week or a day and see what happens. The prediction is that the circulation of falsehoods would diminish, and people's belief in falsehoods would also diminish, probably very significantly, because if you know you might get a not trust button, things will correct themselves some. Now, there are lots of questions to be raised about this that are completely fair. Like if you have one set of political convictions, you might have an army of distrusters that's pressing. So they game the system, and that could screw it up. Oh, that's all completely fair. So take the trust experiment that Tali Sharot did, which is in our book called Look Again, by the way, in case you've forgotten. I almost forgot myself for a second. Is that what it's called? Look Again. That's what it's called. The experiment worked on her, as you say, clone. It might not work, but then we need to think of things that might work in reducing the spread, let's say, of at least damaging falsehoods.
I mean, you understand incentives. Incentives work in that they do work, right? We get more of what we pay for, whether that's paying in terms of attention or paying in terms of some sort of reward. So it does beg the question around what sort of things we are optimizing for in society. And clearly we have been optimizing for distrust. We've been optimizing for likes and engagements, of course, as you said earlier, like as long as the story was entertaining, it doesn't matter if it was exaggerated or if it was using sort of personal facts, that fulfills the kind of objectives of the game of society that most of us are playing at the moment. And that sort of brings me to the other thing that you spoke about, I think quite early on in the book, around social media itself and around some of the experiments done there with the opportunity cost, where you try to actually quantify that, or at least the experiments that you wrote about did there. What were some of the thoughts there around our perceived and real, shall we say, sort of loss aversion when it comes to spending time on these platforms that have been designed in certain ways to elicit certain responses from us?
So here's some data that a bunch of people, a very large number of people, were asked, how much would you have to be paid to be off social media for a month? And a large number of them said approximately 100 euros. And then half of them were told, okay, we're going to give you 100 euros, you're off. And the other half were told, we're not going to give you 100 euros, but we're going to ask you a bunch of questions about your month. And the question is, you have a large population that's off and a large population that's on. How is life going for those two groups in the month? It turned out that the people who were off for a month had a better month than the people who were on. They were happier with their lives, number one. They were more satisfied with their lives, number two. They were less depressed, number three. And number four, they were less anxious. So along every measure, being off for a month was a really good month for people. Now, this isn't to say that everyone should be off social media. It is to say that there's a possibility that for many people, social media is a little like having the dentist put something in your mouth that hurts a little bit and you get used to it. So you habituate and it doesn't hurt terribly after 3 days in, but it's a little bit of a thing. And then once you take it out, you have a feeling of, and that can be true at least for many people with respect to frequent use of social media. There's some data that came out after our book that's consistent with the question, Bronwyn, you raised, where teenagers-ish or college students, young people, are asked, how much would you have to be paid to be off Instagram or TikTok? And they say, consistent with the earlier paper, they say real money, maybe $50, 50 euros. They're going to require a lot of money. But then they're asked, how much would you have to be paid to be off TikTok or Instagram, contingent on everyone being off TikTok or Instagram, or everyone you know being off TikTok or Instagram? And a lot of people say in response to that question, oh, in that case, I'll pay you. You don't have to pay me. If everyone's off, I'll pay you. So the data suggests with respect to TikTok, most people would rather be off TikTok if everyone's off TikTok. They know it's not good for their experience, but they don't want to be the only one who's not on TikTok. And Instagram, it's almost half. Say, I'll pay you to be off if everyone's off. And that suggests that many people have an awareness that it's on net a negative. Now, I'm a big fan, I should say, of social media on balance. I'm pro them for myself, but for many of us, including probably yours truly, less is probably not the worst idea.
Yeah, well, we don't always want what's good for us, right? So, I mean, that's all that sort of subtext that comes through a lot of these things. Like whenever you start delving into behavioral science or this topic, it always comes down to what we want isn't necessarily what's objectively good for us. But then again, who's actually to say that it's not objectively good for us? That's the whole question of why we use utility and economic problems rather than using like dollars or rands or cents or pounds, right? Because
we can measure. So we can measure, people might make a choice And then we can see what it does for their well-being by whatever measures we have. And we can compare that to similarly situated people who didn't make that choice. And there are lots of questions to be raised about this kind of thing. But the idea that people are worse off as a result of X or Y or Z, that's not infrequently demonstrably true.
And that brings something else that wasn't directly covered in your work, but maybe you do have a view on it, in that quite a lot of the things that you spoke about here also allude to ideas of things like happiness and how satisfied we are with our life, which is a very subjective question. I think you open with one of those examples. There's two sort of fictional or fictionalized women, and the one feels happy and the other doesn't feel happy. And that is the question of happiness and how we can measure it and how we can compare it, because it is so subjective. And it's just, they just come out with the latest World Happiness Index, right? And the same old suspects, always the top and the others always the bottom. But there are, of course, other sorts of questions around how different nations and cultures actually define being happy. And some of them define happiness as feeling objectively joyful, and others just an absence of sadness, which obviously in sort of self-reported studies makes it very, very difficult to sort of actually compare objectively whether people in one country are happier than others, if the norms or the language or the vocabulary understanding of these sorts of ideas differ, right? But still, we do know that happiness and our awareness of that does affect how happy we are individually, even on a scale of 1, just for me, rather than comparing me to other people, which I think the comparison gets a little bit difficult. But still, the idea of sort of appreciating what you've got as opposed to constantly or discounting it, becoming just oblivious to what you have. I think that's a kind of profound point. But I don't know if you have, the question I'm getting to in my very messy framing there is, I don't know if you have looked at the degree of habituation across individuals and societies and how that relates to the happiness data that is put out every year and actually used to guide policy at places like the UN and UNDP, right? So is this a factor that people are looking at? Or is it something that is not being looked at yet, which is why you're doing this sort of work and writing these sorts of books and doing this kind of research?
Okay, so the topic of habituation, people getting decreasingly attentive over time to things that are amazing, and the same is true for things that are amazing in a bad sense. That's pretty new as a topic, and in policy domains, I'm not aware that it's playing a role. Work on happiness is on government's view screen. So when I worked in the US government, we were very alert to the work on self-reported well-being, and we're very interested in what that would tell us about the impact of policies. There's recent work from the United States at very high levels, this is all completely public, that for a poor person to get a specified amount of money has more of an impact on their well-being than for a rich person to get the same amount of money. So if you give someone in South Africa who's very poor X amount of money, the impact on their well-being will be much larger than if you give someone who's rich that same amount of money. And that matters for policy purposes, that the welfare impact of giving people money who are really struggling is higher than the welfare impact of giving a certain amount of money to people who aren't struggling. In the UK, there's been much more emphasis on the happiness or welfare effect of policies. That's something the UK government has been all over for a number of years. There's a guy named Richard Layard. He's called Sir Richard Layard because he's a sir, who has done foundational work on this, who's been influential in the United Kingdom. In other governments, there's awareness of this and occasional emphasis on this. In New Zealand, there was a keen emphasis on happiness and well-being in their budget a number of years ago. The increasing attention being paid to mental health is influenced by the not exactly shocking finding that if people are suffering from depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder or something, the distress level is going to be very high unless they get help, and that to attend to that can produce very big benefits in terms of making people's life less pervaded by suffering. And that's a really good thing to do. With respect to the cross-national comparisons, I would kind of sneak up on that. Daniel Kahneman, died. His last paper from last year is a study of the effect of money on well-being. And the basic upshot is that people who have more annual income are happier within the United States than people who have less. It's a striking finding. Now, are they much happier? No. But are they happier on average? Yes. Except that people who are in the lowest it's not even quintile, the lowest 15% of happiness, their happiness jumps as they go up to $100,000 a year. And then it doesn't increase anymore. So take the 15% least happy people. Now, why they're less happy, let's just bracket that. It might be they're grieving, it might be they're depressed or something. As their money goes up to 100,000, their happiness increases. But at 100%, there's a threshold. They don't get happier. And that's super interesting. It must be because at low poverty and close to poverty, more money is really good, whoever you are. But if you're depressed at 100,000, 200,000, it doesn't really matter. You're just, you got something on your shoulders that's very heavy. Now, that I think is suggestive of the credibility. Sorry, there's my dog who doesn't like this data at all, and so she's mad. But the data is suggestive of the credibility of measures of happiness that within country credible. I'm bullish on a cross-country credible too, with qualifications. That the idea that people in Scandinavian countries are showing very high levels of well-being, and people, let's say, in desperately impoverished countries aren't, that's credible, because we have an account by which that would be true. And the idea that people in Scandinavian countries are happier than people in, let's say, European nations where the economies are doing pretty well, that needs an explanation. But this isn't junk science. I guess I'd say, to your point, we do need to think about culture. There's some data that Kahneman was involved in suggesting that people in France are showing lower levels of happiness than people who are otherwise very similar in the United States. And what's going on there? And Kahneman's line was that in the United States, if you're unhappy, you're pathetic. And in France, if you're happy, you're superficial.
Yeah, this the peer pressure. It's peer pressure not to look too happy.
Completely. So
that attention to yourself. We remember the past, right?
So that's the idea. Maybe if people in France are showing lower levels of self-reported happiness than people in the United States, it's not because they're less happy, it's cultural. But and these are important qualifications, but I think we have reason to think that the cross-national comparisons, we shouldn't exactly take them to the bank, but we should take them seriously.
Before I hand over to you, Peter, I just wanted to continue one other thought there. When you do put it out there, like you're saying, like happiness and economic prosperity are so closely tied, in fact, are infinitely paired. Unless you are in that very unfortunate, depressed, stressed for physical reasons or for circumstantial reasons bracket, which is understandable. So we can sort of bracket that. That Kahneman sort of research did point out that happiness and wealth paired together sort of infinitely. Doesn't that also make a slightly uncomfortable sort of policy point there, in that happiness is a sort of ever elusive goal for any population, right? Much like individuals. So I think you kind of touched on in your book, this whole idea that habituation is what drives us forward, right? because we get used to levels of objective, comfort, but we still want more. And I just sort of have to kind of put the point out there, given all the conversations around pressure towards things like degrowth and being happy with what you've got. How does that fit with human nature? How much resistance are we going to get when we look at data like happiness and wealth go together in one direction at the same time? We need to kind of at some point, be satisfied with what we have. And what sort of conundrum does that pose for policymakers? Just because I know that you work with these.
It's fantastic. You're raising fantastic points. So thank you, and a lot of them. So I think what the world needs now, forgive me, those of you who like degrowth, is not degrowth. And the reason degrowth doesn't make my heart sing is, first, growth is associated with lots of objectively important things like longevity and better health, as well as capacities to live lives that have so many more things in them. So growth, not degrowth, I say. Growth that's sustainable rather than growth that's destructive, by all means. Second, it is true that people habituate to higher levels of economic well-being. So it might be that you have a raise, you go up by 10% in your income, and the day you get that raise, you're thrilled, and maybe that year is positive, but you get used to it, and the amount of, let's say, happiness boost from greater income isn't as much as you expected when you first got it. Nonetheless, it's true that on average, and I think Kahneman would be the first to say we want to be careful with this data. It's only about one country, and there are also lots of qualifications in it. To say that people who earn, let's say, $150,000 a year are happier than people who earn $90,000 a year appears to be true. But that doesn't mean that they're much happier. So the magnitude is actually not that big. And it also doesn't mean that anything like a $150,000 person pulled out of a pocket of millions is going to be happier than a $90,000 person pulled out of the same group of millions. There's a lot of heterogeneity there. So even if on average, people, let's say, who aren't bald are happier than people who are bald, which might be true, I'm here to tell you that there are plenty of people who are at least baldish, a little bit bald, who are completely happy, notwithstanding that tragic event that befell them that they don't think about much. So we want to make sure that average benefits aren't skewing our judgment about the importance of increases in average income to individuals. Then you make a point about habituation having a good feature. If we didn't habituate, we'd be a little stuck and we wouldn't want to do new things. You're completely right. So think about, all of us maybe think of our first job. I'm thinking about my first job. I got to work for the government. I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. I made $125 a week, as I recall. I was happy as a clam. It was the most exciting thing ever. If I had felt, forever that this was the best thing, then it was a pretty good job, as I recall. But $125 a week, that's not incredibly fantastic. And doing the same job I was doing was a good job. But doing it for 30 years, that wouldn't be so great because I habituated to it in part. And so to habituate can make people think, I want to do something new and different and better. And that's really good for our species.
Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to return to the tragedy of loss of trust, because I think that this is a really corrosive feature of modern society. And as you were talking about it and then thinking about habituation to it, I kept coming back to the Pink Floyd song "Comfortably Numb." And that it's a great descriptor of the way that we are with that loss of trust. And most of the time I live on a small island off the coast of British Columbia, and it's a very high trust society, high enough trust that pretty much Nobody locks their doors. Many people leave the keys in their car when they go to the grocery store because, well, what's somebody going to do? They're not going to take your car off the island. So there's kind of some structures that allow for the trust, but it's such a deeply a deep increase in the quality of life to live in a high trust society. And so the question that I have is, because I'm not a policy person, but you're Mr. Policy, what can we do from a policy point of view to shake people up, to dishabituate them from their comfortable numbness about the lack of trust that has settled like a pox on the land? I don't know what we can do, but I really think that it's such an important thing for us to go for.
This is a fantastic question, and I don't have a fantastic answer. So I've spent a lot of the last 2 years on the topic of habituation and dishabituation, and the relative invisibility over time to people of wonderful things in their lives to which they have habituated, and people's relative indifference to things that aren't great in their lives to which they've habituated. And we know about the mechanisms behind that, something about how to dishabituate people to that. The topic of trust isn't discussed in the book. The topic of lying and the topic of believing lies, those get considerable attention. Trust is I find a very challenging topic to get one's mind around. And let me start, I have on my office door, this isn't because Danny Kahneman died, I've just had it there for 2 years, a quote from him in which he says, it's not a matter of thinking, it's an empirical question, and I don't have the evidence. And the reason I have that there is that he was asked, a lot of questions in one interview in particular about things he just didn't know, and he wasn't going to speculate. He said, it's empirical question, I don't have the evidence. So the first question I would like to ask, and forgive my fussiness, is diminution in trust where and measured by what, and what's the magnitude and what's the timeline? So as you describe your community, it's trust pervaded. It sounds as if there's been stable and high levels of trust. That's great. I'm talking from Washington, D.C. right now. Part of the time I live in a suburban community, kind of rural in Massachusetts. The level of trust is so high there. It's off the charts, at least, and I'm defying my data, my love for data. This is just an observation of life. So it might be wrong, but so I want to know, where is trust diminished? Why? By what measure? And why? So maybe it's true in France that the trust of government bodies is lower than it once was. Maybe it's true that in Brazil, the level of trust of financial institutions is higher than it once was. So where is trust increasing? Where is it decreasing? This is knowable. There's a lot of data on this. It's knowable. It's not known by me. With respect to how to gain trust and how to lose trust, I have thought about this a little bit independently of this habituation work. And it's a little like, to gain trust, there's a risk that it's like trying to figure out how to fall asleep. If you think you can't go at it directly. So if you're trying to get to sleep and you can't, you're having insomnia, to think I want to sleep is not productive. It'll keep you up. It's the opposite of productive. So for a policymaker to think, I want to get trust, let me get trust. How do I get trust? That's a little too direct, meaning you have to earn trust. So do things that are trustworthy is a way to earn trust. So if, let's say, financial institutions in Argentina aren't trusted, then do trustworthy things for the next 6 months and be very specific. about what you're going to do that's trustworthy and actually let people know you're doing the trustworthy things. Now, it might be under conditions of extreme distrust. It's really hard for financial institutions to get trustworthy, but life is long and we're all young, and so keep at it. In schools, I'm thinking, are the schools trusted? Are the teachers trusted? Often the answer to that is emphatic yes. Are they more trusted or less trusted than they were 10 years ago? I think the technical term is good to know. And figure out if they're less trusted, why is that exactly? Is that they've done something financially inappropriate, or they haven't taught well or something? So I want to get very specific about not trust as an abstraction, but the particular thing that has bred trust or distrust. And that's kind of the direction. To be habituated to distrust, that's a complicated concept, but you're quite right. It's a thing where if you feel that, let's say, the police aren't trustworthy, you might be habituated to that. And I'll actually tell you a story. So I served on a jury in the United States, improbably, because I'm a law professor. I thought I'd be excluded from the jury. And I learned later the lawyers wanted to get me off, and the judge, he shouldn't have done this, but the judge said he's a law professor. He should see what a jury's really like. Keep him on. The lawyers didn't like that, but he was the judge and he got me on. In the jury deliberations, one of the jurors said, we were a group of 12, said the defendant was accused of punching a police officer. So it was physical injury to a police officer. And the defendant said, I'm sorry, one of the jurors said, the defendant's stupid. He was out at night. You should never be out at night. Never. Because there are only two things that can happen. One is you'll get arrested, and the other is you'll get assaulted. And everyone in the room nodded. Said, yeah, except me. In my life, the idea that you can't be out at night because the police officer will assault you or you'll be punched by some criminal, that's just not life. But for 11 people of the 12 of us, that was life. And they didn't nod with shock and amazement. They nodded like he had said, dropped objects fall. That's obvious. So obviously should have been out. So they were habituated to circumstances of high level of distrust, both of the police and of their neighbors. So it can happen. And this is a long-winded way of saying, I want to get very fine-grained in figuring out the locus of distrust, and then see how the subject of distrust can do something trustworthy for a sufficiently long period to make trust grow.
I just put in a link there of the map of countries where people have interpersonal trust more and less so, and it does map quite neatly onto the maps around self-reported happiness. So maybe there's a link there. And I do know from looking at various bits of data around COVID that countries that had higher levels of interpersonal trust, in other words, trust between individuals, were the countries that ended up having better outcomes in both terms of lives and livelihoods, right? And that was sort of regardless of whether the governments that they had were very authoritarian, very controlling, or more libertarian and hands off. So there seems to be some sort of a link there. Maybe someone wants to run with that research project, because trust, happiness, and general overall flourishing outcomes is probably something that we should be looking at, especially now when we're trying to build trustless societies, right? That was the express goal of many forms of technology and policy at the moment, which I think is quite incredible. Does anyone else have a comment? We don't have that much time left, and I want to make sure that anyone that does have a question gets it answered. Again, if you're feeling a bit shy, pop it into the chat. Otherwise, please raise your hand. And Peter, you've still got your mic off, or on. So if there's anything else you want to add or ask, I'm very happy to hand you the floor back. You're very quiet. Okay, I have other questions, so I can just keep going. I really don't mind. Again, coming back to the conversation around happiness and how you say that you can start to kind of quantify these things. There was a bit in the book where you did speak about quantifying sort of lost, shall we say, quality of life, where you spoke about being involved with an accident and then people trying to persuade you to essentially take compensation. And I thought the maths behind that was quite interesting. Maybe you want to elaborate on that a little bit. So firstly, the sort of ethics as to whether we should be sort of trading human life and quality of life for mere, dollars and mere crass currency, where the sort of the moral justification from that comes from. And I think you wrote about it quite eloquently in the book. And then also in terms of how you actually price that. What do the equations say when we sort of layer on diminishing returns to happiness over time, which has been such a part of the conversation today?
Okay, so in 2017, I was walking home on the street and it was dark and snowy, and I was hit by a car going very fast. I should have been killed. Instead, I had like a zillion broken bones and a terrible concussion. And why am I telling you about this? That it wasn't horrible, as it turned out. It wasn't good at all, but it wasn't horrible. And if the driver had been negligent, as maybe the driver had been, I didn't want to sue the driver. I felt sorry for the driver. Wouldn't have made me feel better to sue the driver, or made me feel worse. But people asked me, will you sue the driver? And I said no. If I had sued the driver and the driver had been negligent, I would have gotten money. How much money? Well, that depends on two things. First, what was the pain and suffering I experienced? And second, what was the hedonic loss, as it's called, loss enjoyment of life? So I'm a tennis and squash player, and I wasn't playing a lot of tennis and squash for some number of weeks. I actually went on the squash court 3 weeks after getting smashed and threw the ball up and hit it with my racket. And then I started laughing at how hard it was to do that. So I didn't have the fun of squash. Now, to turn the lost fun and the pain and suffering into monetary equivalence is very challenging. To give people who, let's say, were hurt at work or on the street, zero, that wouldn't be so good. So to give them some money is probably a good idea. Let's just notice that for some things, like the lost use of a finger, the effect on well-being is likely to be approximately zero. That intuition isn't consistent with this, but if this finger doesn't work for the rest of your life, I'm here to tell you it's likely that you're not going to be even a little bit less happy. On the other hand, if you have headaches which strike you intermittently 7 times a day, that's not good at all. And it might be that intuition suggests you can't use your finger for the rest of your life. That's horrible. Headaches, everyone gets headaches. That's not so bad. But intuition overstates the negative impact of something to which you can habituate and understates the impact of something to which you have a hard time habituating. So the basic idea, thank you for mentioning this, is that we have to monetize harm in the sense that people deserve to be compensated for suffering that's been imposed upon them by a wrongdoer. To turn it into monetary equivalence is very difficult. However we do it, it should be alert to the fact that some things we get used to and don't bug us too much, and other things we don't get used to and they really do bug us. Now, if we get used to, let's say, having a leg that doesn't allow us to run, so our emotional well-being isn't lost, that we can't run, and then give the person nothing, that probably is not a good idea, because losing a capability, that is the capability to run, is a real loss, even if people aren't made sadder by it. So
And we also know that as we've spoken about earlier today, that money does make you happier. So there's kind of there's kind of something else to think about there too. Like, but there are many sort of moralists who would say, oh, you can't give money, you know, for like lost happiness or a lost loved one or a lost love. But when the data tends to point in a slightly different way to what might make us feel comfortable, then we have to kind of listen to it. But we've come to the end of the hour, and I know I did promise I would give you back to the people that you have to work with for the rest of the day on the hour. So I just want to thank you so much, Cass, for being so generous about telling us about your new book. And to close off with, tell people where they can buy the book, why they can buy the book, and why they should buy your next book that's coming up that we spoke about just before we started this.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the book is called Look Again. You can buy it, will you forgive me if I use the A word, at Amazon. Amazon sells the book. But if you want to use an independent bookstore, and I salute you if you do, go to an independent bookstore, and if they don't have Look Again, they probably just were negligent and they want to have Look Again. So Look Again you can get online or at bookstores. I have another book coming out in about a month and a half called How to Become Famous, which is a guaranteed can't miss, must have go-to guide. It's a manual, how to become famous, and anyone who gets the book, if you want to become famous, it'll show you how. It won't, you can't do it in a day, but if you don't get famous in 3 weeks, well then you probably didn't read the book closely enough.